Standardized education traditionally operates on a mechanical assumption that a classroom is a data processing facility. Information is delivered, cognitively processed, and stored for later retrieval. But that linear pathway from input to memory storage does not exist in the human brain. Biologically, every piece of data must first pass through a complex emotional and stress response gateway before cognitive integration can even begin. If that physiological gateway is closed by anxiety or perceived threat, the data never reaches the prefrontal cortex. The emotional state dictates whether learning occurs at all. Yet, the modern curriculum demands a constant output of high-level executive functions. We expect sustained focus, the ability to delay gratification, and the resilience to push through difficult tasks. We are demanding these highly advanced outputs from adolescents whose biological hardware to produce them is still years away from being fully constructed. To bridge that gap, the physical and relational environment of the classroom has to act as external scaffolding for that developing brain. In this model, teachers manage the neuroregulatory ecosystem required to prevent systemic failure in the student's cognitive processing. The endocrinologist Hans Selye defines stress as an organism's response to any perceived threat to its homeostasis. The body is forced into a physiological reaction to regain balance. If we look at this historical photograph of an early classroom, we see rigid rows and strict environmental control. These spaces were built for a purely cognitive data transfer model, entirely ignoring the physiological state of the students. When biological homeostasis is ignored, stress becomes maladaptive. The student's nervous system locks into a prolonged state of alert, quickly leading to severe physical exhaustion. This presents as measurable physical symptoms: an accelerated heart rate, chronic muscle tension, and pervasive physical weakness. These physical states cascade directly into cognitive failure. The brain generates distorted, catastrophic thoughts and magnifies minor problems, effectively blocking the retention of new academic information. Without a structural framework to manage biological stress, the cognitive machinery inevitably shuts down. To understand why this shutdown happens so easily in teenagers, we have to look at the core neurobiological timeline of puberty. Different regions of the brain mature at drastically different rates. The deep subcortical structures, specifically the amygdala and the striatum, wire up early and fast. These centers process emotion, seek rewards, and crave novelty. They reach full operational intensity years before the outer layers of the brain finish developing. Those outer layers, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, are responsible for error detection, complex decision-making, and controlling impulses. Because their automatic inhibitory responses are still under construction, an adolescent has to exert intense conscious effort just to detect a behavioral error and stop themselves from acting on it. This asynchronous maturation creates a temporary, yet severe, biological vulnerability to external stimuli and social pressures. It is the precise reason why their responses appear so disproportionate to adults, swinging wildly between extreme withdrawal and reckless engagement. Teenagers are neurologically wired to experience intense emotions long before they possess the hardware to regulate them. This structural imbalance is further complicated by massive chemical shifts, particularly involving dopamine. This chart illustrates two dopamine receptors. The D1 family, driving goal-oriented behavior, and the D2 family, regulating behavioral flexibility, both spike during puberty. Their extreme volatility chemically drives adolescent impulsivity and the relentless search for novelty. Simultaneously, surging levels of oxytocin and testosterone amplify their drive to form social bonds and secure their status within a hierarchy. Because the adolescent brain prioritizes these social signals over solitary logic, research indicates that simply being in the presence of peers doubles the amount of risk-taking behavior compared to when they are alone. The brain becomes hyper-tuned to peer feedback, registering social rejection as a literal physical threat. For an adolescent, the classroom is a high-stakes arena for social survival. Their neurochemistry forces them to prioritize peer integration over academic tasks. Because the classroom is filled with both academic hurdles and complex social dynamics, students will inevitably experience frustration. As psychiatrist Dan Siegel points out, this frustration is an essential error signal for the developing brain. If parents or teachers constantly intervene to prevent a child from failing, they deprive the prefrontal cortex of the precise data it needs to calibrate cognitive flexibility and resilience. However, schools often fall into a pedagogical trap by treating all emotional outbursts as identical disciplinary infractions, ignoring the underlying biology. We must distinguish between two behavioral outputs. The first is the tantrum, a goal-driven expression of frustration when an objective is blocked. It requires firm boundaries, discipline, and emotional validation to process it appropriately. The second path is the emotional crisis. This is an involuntary physiological system failure. It occurs when the nervous system is subjected to an excess of sensory or emotional stimuli that it cannot process, resulting in a complete shutdown of executive function. A crisis cannot be reasoned away. It only resolves when the sensory input is drastically reduced, or when physical exhaustion forces the student into sleep or withdrawal. Applying punitive, tantrum-style discipline to a sensory overload crisis is biologically counterproductive. It simply pours more stress into a system that is already overflowing. Educators must diagnose the neurological root of the behavior. Misidentifying a system failure as defiance guarantees that the intervention will make the problem worse. This brings us back to the role of the teacher. Psychologists refer to educators as secondary attachment figures. Because their prefrontal cortex is under construction, adolescents cannot self-regulate reliably. The teacher's physical presence acts as an external regulatory signal. A teacher's calm response bridges the gap, allowing the student to biologically downregulate their amygdala. This allows for cognitive reappraisal. The teacher validates the student's frustration, confirming that the work is hard, without removing the academic obstacle causing the stress. This validation establishes the neurobiological safety the student needs to process the initial error signal and actually learn from the failure. Children construct their internal models for handling stress by directly observing and mirroring the adults around them. Empathy functions here as a measurable biological intervention, providing the student with the executive function they have yet to develop. If the student's ability to learn depends on this neuroregulatory link, relying solely on the emotional intelligence of a single teacher creates a single point of failure. Ensuring every student is regulated requires integrating these practices into the school's structural policy. Data from structured implementations, like the Educación Responsable program across hundreds of schools, shows that formal emotional education yields empirical improvements in student neurobiology. As we see in this data on mindfulness practices in adolescents, systematic emotional training directly reduces baseline anxiety and measurably improves working memory, concentration, and executive control. Integrating dedicated physical spaces like calm corners or peace tables provides consistent environmental cues that trigger physiological downregulation before a crisis occurs. Applying structural rigor to emotional education actively wires the adolescent brain for lifelong adaptability and resilience.